This is the climatographer's Dr. Mark Trexler with the Climate Countdown for the Costa Report, where our goal is to bring you actionable climate knowledge. Today's question: what's the role of nature-based solutions in tackling climate change? Nature-based solutions to climate change are based on preserving, restoring, or expanding the amount of carbon being stored on land or in the oceans. They reduce carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, thus slowing global warming. Protecting tropical rainforests, planting trees, increasing the carbon in agricultural soils, improving cattle grazing practices, and ocean fertilization all represent nature-based solutions. Nature-based solutions aren't new. The very first carbon offset project implemented more than 30 years ago in Guatemala was an agroforestry project intended to protect nearby rainforest. In terms of climate change, it was a very different time. Companies were just beginning to think about climate change, and they welcomed the low costs and co-benefits offered by nature-based solutions, many of which initially focused on protecting tropical forests and their biodiversity. At the time, few people were talking about aggressive national or international climate policies. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change had not yet released its first report, and serious climate change was generally characterized as being decades away. Nature-based solutions were talked about as buying time for a cost-effective transition to a low-carbon economy. Fast forward 30 years, a lot has changed. For starters, climate change is generally seen as having arrived and is publicly characterized as a much bigger and much nearer-term crisis than ever before. We never did embark on that orderly low-carbon transition that nature-based solutions were supposed to buy time for. In fact, global emissions of greenhouse gases have risen substantially over the last 30 years. Ironically, greenhouse gas emissions would have to go basically to zero over the next 30 years to stand a chance of accomplishing the objectives of the 2015 Paris Agreement. The magnitude of that challenge is hard to overstate. Strangely enough, nature-based solutions are all the rage today, even more so than in the past. As more and more companies voluntarily commit to zeroing out their net carbon emissions by 2050, they have started looking for the billions of tons of carbon offsets they'll need, since their actual emissions won't fall to zero or anything even close to zero. Nature-based solutions are once again being framed as a cost-effective way to buy time while we, maybe, transition to a low-carbon economy. But at some point, buying time no longer works, and given today's changed circumstances and the growing urgency associated with efforts to tackle climate change, it's prudent to question the wisdom of relying on nature-based solutions going forward. For one thing, we've learned over the last 30 years that nature-based solutions aren't that easy to deploy. It is much easier to estimate the climate change mitigation potential of stopping tropical deforestation, for example, than it is to actually end tropical deforestation. It's been a global priority for more than 40 years, yet we have relatively little to show for the many initiatives that have been undertaken. Why would we expect that to suddenly change now? Second is climate change itself. Many nature-based solutions are quite sensitive to climatic conditions, and we're already seeing disruptive fires, droughts, heat extremes, and flooding events. We also know that the situation is going to get worse in the future. So what's the actionable knowledge takeaway? There are plenty of good reasons to pursue the kinds of initiatives generally characterized as nature-based solutions. But when it comes to relying on them to mitigate climate change, companies planning to purchase billions of tons of nature-based carbon offsets should recognize that they're effectively buying a fire extinguisher with a label stating, "Warning, may fail in case of fire." This is Mark Trexler with the Costa Report's Climate Countdown. Thanks for listening.